Welcome to Instrumental History, a multi-part podcast experience produced by Radio Bristol and the Birthplace of Country Music Museum to explore the history and impact of one of the most important guitars in the history of popular music, Jimmie Rodgers' 1928 Martin 00045 guitar, commonly called the Blue Yodel guitar. This guitar is often classified as one of the most influential and valuable guitars in the history of popular music, and it's been on display at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum for the last 9 months. So if you haven't seen it, well, you have certainly missed out on a huge piece of American musical history. My name is Clint Holley, and along with my co-host, Scotty Almany, we're going to explore why Jimmie Rodgers came to Bristol, the construction of the Martin guitar, and the impact of the guitar on popular music and its continuing impact on today's music. Tonight, we are going to explore the beginnings of our story, and we're going to celebrate the history of Jimmie Rodgers and learn how Jimmie Rodgers came to Bristol, why he came to Bristol, who was Ralph Peer, and where did Jimmie Rodgers get the notoriety to have such a beautiful instrument produced by the Martin Guitar Company in the first place. Let's sit down with our first guest tonight, René Rodgers, head curator at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum, and get her to tell us a little bit about the background of how Jimmie Rodgers ended up in Bristol in 1927. So tell us a little bit about what you do at the museum, and tell us a little bit about this great exhibit that's going on now at the museum.
Yeah, so I am the head curator, like you said. That means I oversee and work with my team to oversee all of the permanent exhibits and special exhibits at the museum, the educational and public programming, and being sure that we're preserving everything properly within our collections. So basically just being a good public trust for the history that we are celebrating at the museum.
And tell us about the history. What is special about the Birthplace of Country Museum, and what event has spurred the creation of this great museum?
So we celebrate the 1927 Bristol Sessions. Those were 2 weeks of location recording sessions that happened here in Bristol in the end of July, beginning of August of 1927 with the Victor Talking Machine Company. So Ralph Peer, who was the producer at the time, came down here on the recommendation of Ernest Stoneman, because Ernest Stoneman told him that he would find a lot of the hillbilly tunes that he was looking for in this area, and recorded 79 different songs from 19 different acts here in Bristol, all hillbilly tunes except for 2 of them, which were classified as race records by L. Watson. And what was really cool about the sessions here in Bristol, because they weren't, a lot of people assume that because we're called the Birthplace of Country Music, that we were the very first recordings of country music, and that is not so. But we were part of a sort of beginnings of that hillbilly music being recorded. But what happened in Bristol was particularly significant because the technology had changed recently from the acoustic horn to the electric microphone, which meant that the records themselves sounded better. The music was more nuanced, more balanced, more vibrant sound. Ralph Peer, who was a visionary, was very influential in the way the music industry today works. And so just having him here and having his expertise here is important. And then, of course, the fact that artists like Ernest Stoneman, who was a recording veteran at that time, recorded here, but also 2 new acts, Jimmie Rodgers, who's now known as the father of country music, and the Carter family, who's now known as the first family of country music, recorded here in Bristol for the very first time in 1927.
Well, I think it's interesting that you brought up that topic, that it's not the beginning of country music, and it's the beginning of the industry of country music.
Yeah, the commercialization of that country music. Right. And you know, that was obviously they were recording songs, hillbilly songs, and selling them before this, but this was really the beginnings of, you know, those 2 sort of foundational acts in particular of the Carter family and Jimmie Rodgers, who were recorded for the very first time, and then another foundational act with Ernest Stoneman, all being here at the same time and getting so much out of that one set of recordings. You know, at the times, often artists were traveling up to like places like New York City or other big studios and recording a song here or a few songs there. But when Ralph Peer came here, he got 19 different acts, like I mentioned earlier, 79 different songs, or 76 different songs, 69 of which were released. So a whole swathe of amazing hillbilly music at once.
And this wasn't Ralph Peer's first adventure out into the hinterlands, was it? He had this kind of plan already in his mind where he had done location recordings before, hadn't he?
Well, he had Certainly, yes. I mean, he had been down in Atlanta when Fiddlin' John Carson did his recordings in 1923, and he had been working for OK before this and been recruited by Victor specifically to build their hillbilly catalog. But he then convinced Victor that he needed to go out and actually do something like this, a long period of time of location recordings, as opposed to, again, one or two songs.
Right.
And actually go out there and do that. But also he had a history before this in race records, so also traveling to get some of those recordings.
Well, I think it's interesting, too. We're using a couple terms here, like people know the music now as country music, and race records might be called the blues or soul or R&B these days. Talk a little bit about how the music was or was not classified back then, because a word like hillbilly has certain connotations, but it was actually, that's what they were calling the music at the time.
Yeah, that was the genre's name. And, right. What's interesting, when we talk about genre, it implies that these are very set boundaries. And certainly from the marketing standpoint, that is often true. That's where genre comes out, is when
right.
you start to sell something, you start to market it, and genre is very helpful with that. But of course, these types of music were building off of each other. Artists were hearing each other and being influenced by each other. People were listening to different kinds of music. So right. Those boundaries are really fluid. But from the marketing and distribution side of things, the record companies were seeing different audiences and trying to market to those different audiences. So for hillbilly music, they were marketing to a white rural audience. For race records, they were African-American artists and then being marketed to an African-American audience. That does not mean that those musics do not connect in any way, because they definitely do. They are influencing each other. You hear similar sounds in them. Sometimes you'll even hear, like I said, in 1927 in Bristol, you have two songs by L. Watson who's recorded and marketed as race records. They weren't super dissimilar from some of the other harmonica pieces that were played by Henry Witter
right.
at those. So, I mean, it's really more about this segregation of sound and segregation of types of music for marketing purposes, but it doesn't really reflect what was necessarily going on with the artists and the audiences.
Well, especially when you mix something like radio into the whole mix, and there are no boundaries for who can listen to radio. And I've heard instances of somebody like Ray Charles saying that they listened to the Grand Ole Opry and they listened to country music. So radio, I think, plays a huge part in all of this too, that and artists used it as their booking, the way to book shows too, didn't they? If
Definitely.
They came to Bristol and they played on the radio, they would try and book some shows in the area, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and I mean, I think, what you're saying about radio is really true, is that it was sort of the opening up of people being able to hear music and listen to music much more widely. You didn't have to have a phonograph and you didn't have to be able to buy records. Obviously, you would have to buy a radio, but those were also found in other places. And just, I think the fact that radio gave people a real chance to sort of listen to different kinds of music, though, of course, still, there would be segregation of sound on the radio.
Right.
There's stories about KLAX, a radio station up in Nashville, who at night would switch over to blues and R&B.
Right.
And, I've heard people in this area from the Black community in this area talk about being really happy to be able to listen to KLAX at night, because it was playing the music that they wanted to hear that they weren't hearing during the day on the radio.
Right.
So,
and for rural, poorer communities, a radio, I've read stories of people who would travel to their friends' farms or whatever to listen to the radio because they didn't have a radio or a phonograph.
Yeah, they would listen together and make a sort of an event of it.
A community event out of listening to the Grand Ole Opry or whatever barn dance they might be able to pull in. Our second guest on Instrumental History is Barry Mazor. He's an award-winning journalist and author who's written 2 books relevant to our conversation: Ralph Peer, The Making of Popular Roots Music, and Meeting Jimmie Rodgers. He's a former editor and columnist for No Depression magazine, and I was really excited to sit down and talk to him about Jimmie Rodgers, what was going on in music in the early 20th century, and how Jimmie Rodgers was in the right spot at the right time in Bristol in 1927. Today in the studio, we have Barry Mazor, expert on many topics, but today we're going to talk to him about the background of Jimmie Rodgers and leading up to and past the Bristol sessions. And also here is Scotty Almany. And Scotty, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Scotty Almany. I'm my job title is so long, but I guess I'll say it. I'm the digital media programming and exhibit logistics manager for the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. And we recently acquired the Jimmie Rodgers 1928 triple aught 45 Martin guitar on loan to display in our museum. And so for part of the programming to go along with that, we decided to do this podcast. And when we were putting together a list of folks to talk to, Barry, your name definitely came up pretty quick. And yeah, thank you for agreeing to meet with us and talk about it with us today.
My pleasure.
Well, so the first question, it's pretty open-ended, but we just wondered if you could tell us just a little bit about Jimmie Rodgers' early life.
Sure. There's a lot of mythologies about it. He was from the little but burgeoning city, really, small city of Meridian, Mississippi, born in 1897, which is kind of crucial in itself in terms of what he was exposed to. It was a time of great explosions in popular entertainment. A great deal of emphasis is put in a lot of tellings of the story of him as like he was a disappointed railway worker or something. The opposite was true. By the time he was 12 years old, he was already thinking about how can I be a performer. His mother had died when he was quite young, 6, and his father was a railroad section chief, which meant an overseer of people who laid in the tracks, that kind of thing. Like a lot of show business kids to be, his dad wanted him to have a straight job, and the railroad, like he worked, was that straight job. But by the time he was 12, he had run away to join a tent show. He was up on live vaudeville, which was the main thing at the time. He had a record collection as soon as that was possible, very important. He was a fan of the incoming silent cowboy movies, and the life he led, his early life was, you could think of it as a kind of a Huck Finn life, if you think of it that way, with dad away all the time working and no mom. He lived with his aunt, and you would find him in barbershops, pool halls. These were where guys hung out, and they were traveling entertainers or salesmen, politicians. He wasn't working. He wasn't hanging with Mississippi's finest. and that was the life he led, and he wanted to sing. He was fascinated by that, and he was married a couple of times, briefly when very young, which didn't go well. And then the marriage that lasted him and counted him, where his daughter Anita came from, to Carrie Williamson, who was from a respectable family in Meridian and dubious at first, but it worked out. They were married for the rest of his life, and as much as he would travel, that was where he would think of his home base till he eventually relocated to Texas. But in between there, this thing happened at Bristol, that was unlikely, unheard of, which is that he got found. A guy like him from a small town, and you could say this of virtually everybody who came to Bristol, that there was going to be a route by which he could become one of these recording stars,
right,
or a professional entertainer at all. Seemed really impossible, unlikely. Nobody had any idea how to do it. But this was the route. He kept his ear open. And by the time of Bristol, he had been performing professionally through most of the 20s. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis by 1924. The railroad people didn't like the time off he was taking to perform. That was an unhealthy job, was another thing. So more and more, it looked like performing was going to be the way for him to make a living, if he could find a way to do it. So he had formed a small jazzy band with his sister-in-law, Elsie McWilliams, who would be crucial in his career. She was a songwriter, too. And that was for a while. He worked for tent shows and vaudeville shows out around the country, where a lot of the things he did later were already on display, lest anybody think they were like made up in the spot at Bristol or after he'd been doing that. Blue yodeling, the whole thing, which we'll get into. So, but he saw himself as a Southern vaudeville entertainer who sang a lot of yodeling blues. He didn't know he was the father of country music, and nobody else did either for many years, because nobody asked the question for a long time. I mean, Nobody cared who was the father of country music for decades to come. That would come later. One of the things that became very clear is that it is true that he and his wife had tried desperately to get record companies, Brunswick for one, which the Carter family had also been turned down by.
Right.
In fact, Victor Records. I have a copy of the letter he said that they sent to Victor Records, less than a year before he met Ralph Peer, where you're sitting, and they turned him down outright because they generally did. So things were blocked until the connection was made there at Bristol with Ralph Peer, who would become crucial in his musical life.
Now, before we move on to the next question, can you tell us a little bit about what the state of the entertainment industry was as Jimmie Rodgers is, maturing into a young man? If vaudeville is still going on, blackface is still going on. What was entertainment and the music, quote unquote, industry like before he became a performer?
Well, it was really becoming an industry. Music publishing had been great. People from all kinds of places and classes had more disposable cash on hand than there had been in a long time. So there was this musical explosion around 1919 and the years right after. And one of the reasons there was any interest in selling to small-town Southern whites, to black people, to other ethnic groups, is that they had money to spend for the first time, and there was a possibility there might be something there. There was such an explosion in the selling of records. People don't understand this often or realize it. There were more records sold in 1919 to 20 than there had been after World War II. A lot of the popular culture that we all grew up with happened then. Radio hit in the 20s, and by the time the same year of Bristol, that 1927 year I always point to as look at the context that Bristol happened. A few weeks before Bristol, Al Jolson was doing The Jazz Singer.
Wow.
Sound movies are coming to us. The newspapers are so mass that people like, say, Babe Ruth hitting 60 home runs that summer. Or Mickey Mouse, or Charlie Chaplin, or Rudolph Valentino were becoming more famous around the country and sometimes globally than anybody had been able to be famous before.
Wow.
So Bristol was part of this mass popular culture that was all taking off at the same time. This newfangled thing called radio was exploding. And in 1927, the same people, Sarnoff and Company, who put together RCA Victor Records, put together something called NBC. You hooked up a bunch of radio stations and you had a national network, which meant radio mattered more on what you could do on it than ever before. So all these things were happening at once. It was an explosion of technology. At Bristol, there was one more element added. The records had been around for years, but they had been a very limited fidelity. And the technology came not long before that meant, they called it orthophonic at Victor, but everybody was working on this.
Right.
Basically, it was the same technology that was being applied to sound movies, but you were using it for records.
Right. Western Electric was developing movies, soundtrack.
Yes, it was all the same. It was the same sound increase that was happening.
Right.
So it also meant that you had higher fidelity recording, which made the recording experience seem much more intimate. And when a guy and then the crooners came along, the Gene Austins, and the Bing Crosbys, all those people, they were singing at a much more intimate, quiet kind of way. Nobody's shouting at anybody like you did across an auditorium.
Right.
Well, it totally changed what the recording industry and popular singing sounded like.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, and Rodgers was part of that. He sang like popular crooners, not like Roy Acuff would tell people, I sang in theaters with determination, which meant he shouted a lot. That was the way that's what people were doing.
Right.
That's what people were doing. And it changed, and all of this created an intimacy which set it up for people to feel very connected and close to artists who did that. And that's the situation Ralph Peer walked into and said, and said, what can we do here?
Right.
Yeah, it's really funny. I was doing some reading on early radio a couple weeks ago, and just to mention, you mentioned, radio was developing, and it was kind of like the cell phones and everything of the day. Heinrich Hertz, who I guess discovered radio waves. I've read a quote from him that was like, I feel like there's not going to be any practical purpose of this discovery. But boy, was he wrong. I mean, radio frequencies.
Well, everything takes time. I mean, think about it. When radio and the telephone came along, everybody understood exactly how they would be used. Radio was for person-to-person, ship-to-shore, and personal communication, and the telephone was in every home, so they could play orchestras over the telephone. That was the original thought. Well, they were wrong for about 70 years until they became right.
Yeah.
Barry sets up a great story and tells us a lot about what was going on in culture in the early 20th century and how Jimmie Rodgers was the right guy at the right time to show up in Bristol in 1927 and become a superstar. But not everybody was a fan, so let's check in again with René Rodgers as she relays an interesting story about a label that maybe wasn't the biggest Jimmie Rodgers fan in the world.
There's a great local story, and I'm probably not going to be able to remember all the details off the top of my head, but there was a local man who owned a record label. It was called Flying Ace Records.
Okay.
Have you heard of this? But what I love about this record label is that he hated the yodel.
Okay.
And so he refused to record any songs with a yodel in them. And on the record label, it says without a yodel. On all the, I mean, he didn't record a lot. Unfortunately, this all was happening around the Great Depression.
Right.
So a difficult time to be a success.
Right.
And that, but he was a songwriter himself and he did not like yodeling. And so he was not a fan, I guess, of Jimmie Rodgers.
So there was actually a yodel backlash.
Yes. Well, maybe just from this one person, but yeah. Right. But I love that. And because we have some stuff, we have several things in our collection about this record label.
Also, there was always that quest in rock and roll to find a white person that sounded like an African American so they could market that music to. And do you think Jimmie Rodgers is kind of like one of those key stepping stones to that point in rock and roll?
I mean, I'm not sure I can say yes or no on that as a music historian. I mean, I'm more of a history historian than a music historian, but I do certainly think that really clear melding of two defined genres.
Right.
And I did air quotes there for those of you who obviously can't see
it.
I do think that is instrumental in sort of maybe listeners and artists seeing the potential in that. And certainly the record labels might then also start to see the potential in it and not think that it needs to be quite so bounded.
Right.
And I think that's the other thing about Jimmie Rodgers, when you were talking about the fact that he has this legacy beyond country stars and country music, is I love to think about all the artists who still play his music and who have played his music since then, who you would never think of as hillbilly singers.
Right.
And also then when there's female singers who have taken on some of his songs and made them their own. I think of Dolly Parton's Mule Skinner Blues in particular.
Right.
And there's a lovely story, and again, I'm not going to remember the full name of it, but they had a song that was basically about Jimmie Rodgers.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and I read about it in Barry Mazur's book, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but
You'll think of it like later on this afternoon, I'm sure.
But, in Africa, that they had heard some of Jimmie Rodgers' music.
Right.
Later down the line. I mean, this wasn't like in the 1920s or 30s. This was later down the line. But they liked it and then sang a song about it.
Wow. I mean, it just shows how the impact of what happened here in Bristol resonated, and continues to resonate around the world almost 100 years later. Now, the songs that Jimmie recorded here in Bristol, they're not really considered like his best work. And he only recorded 2 songs here in Bristol.
He did.
So tell me a little bit more about that, and then what kind of broke Jimmie Rodgers wide open to the general public after Bristol.
So when Jimmie Rodgers came to Bristol, he was with 3 other band members.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all based around Bristol, but they had been working with Jimmie Rodgers down in Asheville, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
They had been performing on the radio together and performing together as the Jimmie Rodgers Entertainers.
Mm-hmm.
And when they came to Bristol, I think they probably heard about it because these 3 had the Bristol connection already, family in Bristol. And they came to audition. They were here on one of either the second to last or the last day of the auditions.
Okay.
So just there under the wire. And at the time, they ended up recording separately. Jimmie Rodgers as a solo act and the 3 other performers as the Geneva Ramblers as a trio. And I think, Jimmie Rodgers, he recorded Sleep Baby Sleep and The Soldier's Sweetheart here in 1927, and one of which had a yodel, one of which didn't.
Right.
And they sold okay, but they weren't the best sellers of the 1927 Bristol sessions, certainly. They did all right. But I think it was what Ralph Peer heard in those 2 songs.
Right.
He heard the potential.
Right.
And it's not that those songs weren't good. It was just, for whatever reasons, they didn't resonate with the public and for whatever reasons. But then he invited Jimmie Rodgers to come record up at the Victor Studios up in New York and New Jersey.
Right.
And that's where he did Blue Yodel No. 1 T for Texas, which is the song. If you don't know Jimmie Rodgers, you know this song.
Right. And that song kind of solidified his persona, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. And I think also, it was an instant hit.
Right.
And his career instantly from that moment went upwards.
Right.
And stayed up throughout his 6 years, his short 6 years that we talked about earlier.
René sets up a great story about the big bang of country music here in Bristol at the end of July, beginning of August of 1927. But how did Jimmie Rodgers get to Bristol, like physically get to Bristol in 1927? And what's the backstory of what brought Jimmie to Bristol so he could sit down in front of Ralph Peer and record the songs that weren't necessarily hits, but showed Ralph the kind of talent and personality that Jimmie had? So let's check back in with Barry Mazor and get that story directly from him. What
brought Jimmie to Bristol in 27? Was he targeted maybe by Ralph Peer via Ernest Stoneman, or did they just see the ad in the paper?
We don't know. In their case, it was neither one. They both had vaguely heard of each other before this. Jimmie and his band, the so-called Entertainers, who hadn't been together very long at all. We'll get to that, I guess. But they had been playing in Asheville, North Carolina, and they were on the radio locally, occasionally in Asheville, North Carolina. And among the people who heard them there was Bascom Lamar Lunsford, the kind of folklore singer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who knew Ralph Peer well. They went back to his days with OK Records. He had recorded them. They were friendly. Ralph knew that Lunsford was discovering, writing about, and promoting people, so he was aware. And there's evidence that Lunsford had let Peer know that there are these pretty decent guys on the radio here. There's this guy Jimmie Rodgers. He's not bad. So he'd at least heard the name. They hadn't invited them specifically or known exactly where they were. But the fact is, not very long before the Bristol sessions, Jimmie and the Entertainers had played some shows at fairs around Johnson City. Mm-hmm. And there's reason to believe that they heard, that so-called ad had happened. And the word was out that, these scouts are going to be around looking for entertainers around there then. So they kind of knew. And even that wasn't what specifically brought them there that weekend. They got themselves there that weekend because Jack Pierce, one of the Tennifer Ramblers, those entertainers, lived around there and they were all broke, and Pierce wanted to talk his father into buying him a new car. And they had reason to be in the area at the same time these sessions happened. And once they were all there, they all rolled in and said, "Well, we're here to try out." And whether it struck a bell with Peer, he kind of heard of these guys or not, that's how they got there. Coincidentally, the sessions were on, and they walked in.
Now, they were the Jimmie Rodgers Entertainers, and did they change their name specifically to come to Bristol, or what's the circumstances of it? What was the name of the band?
Yeah. It was the other way around.
Okay.
The Tennifer Ramblers, I think that's how it's pronounced. I've never been absolutely sure.
Sure.
There was a food distributor here that used the name too for years. I grew up here, and we always pronounced it Teneva. So I've heard
which is what I used to do, like rhymes with Geneva, but it is 2 N's. So I've been led to understand that they were saying Teneva.
Yeah, I think so too.
Case, any case, that band had been together. Jimmie was constantly looking for. He thought it was good to have backup.
Right.
As much as, sort of folky people always want to hear him alone with his guitar and without all that schmaltz on there, he always wanted that schmaltz on there, some kind. And they were around. He had different people that backed him up, and they had not been together very long, really a few months. They'd met in around May, and they started to do this. And as an outfit, they called themselves, well, basically, he called themselves the Jimmie Rodgers Entertainers.
Right.
As a lead singer will do, that was his job.
Right.
And, it had been kind of stapled together. They'd done a bunch of shows, and they were traveling together, and here they were. I got to say, it's like it was an awkward combination from the beginning, because the kind of music they played, which was old school hillbilly string band music,
right,
was the one time with which he was not particularly comfortable. He didn't sing the way those singers did, and they were not particularly comfortable playing vaudeville blues, which is what he wanted, and other snappy numbers. This was a guy who was going around singing, there'll be a hot time in the old time tonight, the man on the flying trapeze, and ta-ra-ra boom-die.
right.
This is the kind of stuff he'd been singing, and I thought his future was in, because, that was popular. A lot of it was old popular. It was really 1890s music he was falling back on. But that's what he wanted to do. And he sang some of the new popular music, like his eventual buddy Gene Austin's, why do you do me like you do, that kind of stuff. So he wasn't doing Ancient from the Hills hillbilly music or any modern variation thereon, and they were. They were trying to make the best of it, because he always tried to make the best of everything. Well, that was his nature.
And his image was very, cosmopolitan too. He wasn't dressing like a backwoods, string band member. I mean, did he always have that fashion sense that he kind of became known for later on?
Oh, he always had something. He always had a sense that the way he presented himself was going to be the way they saw him.
Right.
Because he's going to go on to present himself every which way and loose. When he wanted to look like a rambling gambler, he looked like it. When he wanted to look like a cowboy, he looked like it. When he wanted to look like, you name it, he would do that to make it work. And this is part of what the Bristol Sessions were about. Ralph Peer had an agenda there. And the agenda was the reason Victor hired him. He'd been doing roots music, including earlier country music.
Right.
Okay, including the Stonemans and Witter and Grayson. I mean, he'd had sort of hillbilly hits there. Victor hired him because they didn't know how to do it. They had one big hit in the Prisoner song with Vernon Dalhart.
Right.
He was, a semi-opera singer that were doing these old songs. They didn't know how to get hold of genuine from-down-home singers, where this was part of their culture, and they had these whole repertoires. And so he was looking for people who had songs who expanded on, described, and almost advertised who they were. In Jimmie Rodgers' case, he realized pretty quickly he could sing practically anything, that he was the more cosmopolitan guy that you just mentioned, and that might go anywhere. And his songs tended to turn out to be about that. He was a brakeman who was the guy who throws hobos off the train, except when he wanted to be a hobo who was a brakeman, threw off the train. He was an outlaw. He was a family man. He was cosmopolitan. He sang about Lord.
Right.
Yeah.
So, this guy has range, and Pierce saw this, and it was exactly the kind of person he had in mind. He didn't invent Jimmie Rodgers, but if he invented somebody, that's who it would have been.
Right.
They found each other right where you are.
You can't talk about Jimmie Rodgers for very long without turning to the topic of songwriting, and a lot of the Jimmie Rodgers song catalog still resonates in today's song catalog. Modern artists still cover Jimmie Rodgers songs. They become an integral part of the catalog of country and bluegrass musicians. When you're cutting your teeth in bluegrass music, you're going to end up playing a blue yodel. You're going to end up playing mule skinner blues. It's just kind of part of the process of becoming a musician in that area of music. But there's nuances to Jimmie Rodgers' songwriting, and René has a lot of insight into those nuances. And one of the characters in the story that's come to prominence more in the last few decades is Jimmie Rodgers' sister-in-law, Elsie McWilliams. So let's check in with René Rodgers from the Birthplace of Country Music Museum and talk to her about songwriting and a little bit about Elsie McWilliams, Jimmie Rodgers' songwriting sister-in-law.
Well, and when you think about a lot of Jimmie Rodgers songs, they do have that sort of confessional feel to them.
Yeah, he's telling you what his sins are.
Yeah, definitely. but with charm.
Right. Now, one of the really big people in the Jimmie Rodgers story that I don't think it's talked about enough is Elsie McWilliams.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about who she was and what her contributions to Jimmie Rodgers' legacy is.
So I love the story of Elsie McWilliams. She is his sister-in-law.
Right.
And she is she's basically the first woman who made a career of being a country music songwriter.
Right.
She wrote with him several of the songs that he recorded. Mm-hmm. She would help to work up some of those songs and work with him directly. And, she spent a lot of time supporting her sister as her husband.
Right.
But, I like the story because, like you said, even though you'll see Elsie McWilliams on the record labels when she's acknowledged
credited right.
as the co-songwriter, I don't think people still make the connection and question, who might that be? So
right.
You're right, her story isn't as well known as it should be. But I also think that it's also a personal story because I think so much of what they did to work together was about talent, obviously between the two of them, the talent that they were sharing, the talent that they were collaborating with together to come up with these amazing songs. And what I love is that the diversity of the different songs that they worked on together.
Right.
There's also this assumption about the kind of songs that a woman will write.
Right.
She does not fit into that mold,
right.
which I love.
Right.
Which I love. But also it's a personal story because it's also about this family connection and the ways that families support each other.
Right.
So it's both a professional and a personal story, and she deserves to be known better than she is.
Now, is there any evidence at all that she was writing songs before her association with Jimmie Rodgers? Have you ever heard or read anything about that?
I don't know enough about her story to answer that, and it's, that's one of the difficulties. One of the things I'd like to get hold of is she did an interview with the Country Music Hall of Fame before she passed, and I'd love to hear that.
Yes.
And just hear her account of how it all came to be. So I think that would be really interesting.
Now, you bring up the Country Music Hall of Fame. Does the Birthplace of Country Music have any connections to the Country Music Hall of Fame, or has there ever been any collaboration with them at all? Or?
There has. I mean, right after we opened, we actually loaned them one of our Western Electric microphones. So that's the microphone,
right.
The type of microphone that was used at the 1927 Bristol sessions. They were doing a small display on the early recording sessions. And so we loaned them that. And they have loaned us objects, for instance, for some special exhibits and also images. There's several of their images up in the museum's permanent exhibits. And they have just loaned us several images for the exhibit we are working on for next year called Women in Old Time Music, which will have something about Elsie McWilliams in it.
Oh, well, there we go. Right.
So, we have worked with them. They're very helpful. We have a good relationship with them, and we hope to work with them in the future.
Because the guitar that Jimmie Rodgers actually played in Bristol in 1927 resides in the Country Music Hall of Fame, correct?
It does, yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
As well, Mother Maybell's guitar, that's the one she bought after the Bristol
It is, yeah. That's her.
The L7.
She played a Stella in 1927. The guitar the Gibson that she bought is that she bought in 1928 is in the Country Music Hall of Fame.
She made quite the upgrade from the Stella to the Gibson.
She did. She did. And it was well worth it.
Right. Well, let's talk about Ralph Peer a little bit, and let's talk about publishing.
With Ralph Peer, he was, like I said earlier, recruited from OK Records by Victor to help build their hillbilly catalog because they were falling behind some of the other record labels who were sort of moving into this early this hillbilly music,
right.
And they were starting to see that there was an audience for it. And so they recruited Ralph Peer away from OK to do that. And he did agree to take a very, I don't know if it was no salary at all, but I do know that it was not a
Very
usual
much,
salary. Yeah,
right.
he negotiated not taking a very big salary in order to have to be able to publish the songs through his own music publishing company. And at the time, that was called the Southern Music Publishing Company.
Okay.
And so that meant that he would then do what I said: copyright the song if there was no copyright, copy the 1927 performance or whichever one that he was doing. And then also with some of them, he then signed artist management contracts,
Okay.
which he did with people like Jimmie Rodgers.
Now, was Ralph Peer viewed as a fair business person? Do you feel like he took advantage of any of these people that he did deals with? Or do you think that by and large that he did as good as anybody in that time period could have done?
I mean, I feel like the way that Ralph Peer was handling things was pretty similar to how it was being done in
Right.
general. At that time, $50 per side plus royalties was pretty good. That's
a lot of money.
That was a lot of money. I mean, and that was one of the things that brought people out to those auditions is that, the original advertisement didn't bring as many people as they'd hoped. And then they did an article where they talked about how much Ernest Stoneman had made in royalties the previous year.
And people came out of the hills.
And it was
right?
like $3,000 plus, which in 1927 is a huge amount of money.
Right.
So I think, I think this was the norm, but I also think, what Ralph Peer was doing was innovative because that sort of copyright structure that he was doing, that industry-specific copyright structure, is how the music industry works today.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Just understanding the value of that intellectual property.
Thanks, René, for telling us more about Elsie McWilliams and Ralph Peer. If you want to find out more about Elsie McWilliams and the songs that she wrote, some of her notable contributions to Jimmie Rodgers' catalog include Blue Yodel No. 7, Everybody Does It in Hawaii, Hobo Bill's Last Ride, and Waiting for a Train. Well, René talked a little bit about Ralph Peer, but Barry Mazor has a lot more information on Ralph Peer and the relationship that he had with Jimmie Rodgers. So let's jump back over to the interview that we had with Barry Mazor and talk to him about Ralph Peer and the business practices that were in place in 1927 revolving around music publishing and the intellectual property of writing songs.
They did, Jimmie and Ralph Peer did maintain a relationship after the Bristol sessions.
Oh, crucially, Peer was his recording producer. He was his manager in a very modern sense, and he was his publisher. All of these at once together, which meant that more than ever, Peer wanted the right song with the right guy. You have to understand, immediately with Jimmie Rodgers, when the songs hit, they would place them with 8 other people. Jimmie was, in a matter of a year or two, riding around in Cadillacs. His wife had minks. Well, the Carters had mink coats too. He was building a mansion in Texas. All of this was on real money.
Right.
The money did not just come. Well, you couldn't make that much from performing live, even though this recording success meant that he was a big attraction. And Peer got him on the low circuit, which was big time vaudeville.
Right.
Very few people in what we call country music. Uncle Dave Macon did some of that, but very few people in country music were going to get booked for that kind of thing yet. Peer signed him up with deals. When you see Jimmie Rodgers with a Wayman guitar, Wayman was a nice company. But basically, Peer knew those people well in Philadelphia and signed him up to endorse him and stick his name on him. And so there were Jimmie Rodgers guitars from Wayman, which he hardly ever played. He carried one around to make sure he was seen with it from time to time because it was a sponsor. Some of this I understood better when I wrote my biography of Ralph Peer than when I wrote Meeting Jimmie Rodgers. Because Meeting Jimmie Rodgers, I came to one conclusion, and it's true, which is how much he took care of his own business out on the road. Jimmie would know the manager of this theater in Tulsa is Jack X and X, and his wife is this. He's got 2 kids. His wife is sick. Last time he paid this. He would know all that stuff to glad hand and get the gig with that guy again. And he would go out endlessly. TB or no TB, this guy did hundreds of gigs a year.
Right.
Ralph wanted to see happen also because it promoted the records. This was a new thing that you showed up in a town and there would be records that Victor would make sure were in the store and you would show up in stores. He did all of those things. And radio appearances sometimes to promote the appearance also. Radio and the record industries didn't quite know how they stood with each other yet. Records were very suspicious of radio.
Right.
It was like the internet, much like the internet later. If the guy was going to be on radio, well, you didn't have to pay for it. You bought for a radio once, and you never had to buy a record again. That's what they were afraid of.
Right.
Victor owed NBC and records because they knew in the long run this wouldn't be true.
Right.
You could promote artists on the radio and sell more records. But that was very unclear to people in those first years.
Now, as a follow-up to the Ralph Peer thing, a couple things. Through the prism of time and history, was the deal that Ralph cut with people like the Carter family and Jimmie Rodgers in terms of publishing, is that considered fair? Did the artists and the writers receive the money that they thought that they should get? And then also, as Jimmie's music kind of evolved, like he does sessions with Louis Armstrong, Hawaiian bands, who was driving that? Like, was that Ralph or Jimmie's vision for the music?
Peer and Jimmie's understanding of Jimmie together. Okay, let me get into that because there's been so much just plain wrong written about that. It's just like
great.
It's like,
right.
The deals that they got were the best anybody had ever had.
Gotcha.
That would be the way to put it. Peer did, quote unquote, keep control of the publishing side of it. He did, in fact, share the songwriter share. This gets pretty technical about how publishing and royalties and work. But every record to this day has what's called the mechanical right with it, which is the publishing of the songs on the record. And that's a separate royalty and it's the real way to make money, by the way.
Yes.
Wildly more money in the publishing on the record than in the record, which Peer understood. And Victor learned real fast after they watched what happened here. Jimmie Rodgers was making money not just for his records, which were selling like crazy then. Typically, right after Bristol, they were selling maybe 500,000 a piece a record. And remember, the population of the country was much, much less than it is today.
Right.
That's a huge percentage-wise. That would be, and not only his record, but Gene Autry was covering it. And this artist, and 8, 9 artists would cover the song, all of which would be coming back to Southern music, Ralph Peer and Jimmie Rodgers. His share, the songwriter share of the publishing, which was paid. It's cents on a record, but he's getting that on the hundreds of thousands of records of his songs done by other people.
Right.
This is how you get rich in the music business.
Yes.
It's just about the only way to get rich in the music business then and now.
Right.
is if you have a piece of the songs. So Jimmie was cool about this stuff. He knew there were real limits to how fast he could write the kind of material they wanted. And he was recording at a rate almost exactly equal to, say, the Beatles and the Stones in the 60s.
Right.
Their contract was for X number of albums a year. His for X, there were no albums to speak of in his day. It was a singles business. But if you add up, he did 112 sides in 5 years, which is about the same as they would do.
Right.
They had to keep coming. And yes, Ralph saw early on that he could handle all these different sorts of backing. And at the same time, you wanted novelty so the thing would sell, not like I have that already. So how to balance that is always a thing to this day, right? You can have an argument about it. Every time they have an argument, that's not country. They're having the same old argument.
Right, exactly. Is this authentic? Right.
I always say country's not the same as it used to be, and it never was. So yes, between them, there was this expansive thing of how you record, what it could be, and he was up for it. To get that song, that sheer number of songs, he would write some. He turned to his sister-in-law, Elsie McWilliams, who was musically trained at the piano, to help. He was asking for help. He was pleading for help.
Right.
I need 10 more songs next month.
Wow.
And he would go to a supply of songwriters who could help. Well, he's writing about gambling and rambling and leaving women and running from police. And some of these are, they don't think it's Elsie McWilliams' life. But she wrote half of those with him. I mean, some of this is image that was created.
Right.
The Carters were sold as down home, even when they were divorced and Sarah had run off with a cousin, had nothing to do, as little to do with AP as humanly possible.
Right.
And they still recorded together. And they were still sold as these down home loving family.
Right.
Jimmie was going to be sold basically as this badass. I mean, they were Sunday morning, he was Saturday night.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
and it wasn't quite true of either of them. It just wasn't so simple, like actual human beings.
Right.
You know?
Right.
But the idea of selling the image and playing into it and finding songs that matched, that was all starting right there. And of course, it never stopped.
Right.
Jimmie Rodgers is selling vast numbers of records, and the Carter family are doing very, very well. But the Depression starts to hit in 1930. Jimmie Rodgers, who was, as they say, once I worked on Ralph here, I had all this correspondence between Jimmie and Ralph and got a different idea of just how collaborative the relation was.
Right.
Try this next. The ballads aren't working. Do more of those comedy talking songs you did with the Carters. Get me some more. There would be a lot of that because they could measure what was happening.
Right.
So the bottom fell out. There's a letter where he said to Jimmie, "You keep at it. I'm worried about you. Don't spend so much money." And they spent like crazy. I mean, it came in one hand and went out the other.
Right.
So he said, "Don't do that. It's like harder now." Everybody says, "You're still the top of the heap, but boy, the heap is smaller." When he said that, well, no, yeah, it was not funny. Basically, the recording industry, which, as I said, in the beginning of the 20s was selling like 50 million records a year,
Right.
dropped 16 to 10. It was down to 5 million in all forms, from classical to hillbilly. By this year, Jimmie Rodgers is at the top of the heap, and that 500,000 has come to 5,000.
Right.
There's no money in it. He got the people like the Carters and Rodgers recording longer, and he took care of them. That's another mythology. He cut out our royalties. Yeah, because there were no royalties.
Yeah.
Right.
Carter's royalties for the first quarter of, I think, 31 were like $62.
Wow.
And he redid their contracts so there was more money up front. What he did, which they didn't exactly understand, he got them bigger advances so they could eat.
Right.
Yeah.
So they were getting hundreds of dollars, which is a lot of money in 1931,
Right.
just to show up. And he kept recording with them. And so Jimmie had decided to move during that period. First, it was considered for his health. There was this mythology always that if you went to the mountains or you went out west or you went these places, it would be better for you if you had TB.
Right.
It wasn't true. It wasn't true, but it was very much believed. And basically, they picked up and moved to Texas, where they built a mansion called the Blue Yodeler's Paradise on money he still didn't have, so Pure paid for the mortgage.
Wow.
But it settled. By that point, he knew he was going to have to travel less, and there was within the field and within the area, he could do a lot of work, and they recorded where they had to. But Jimmie wasn't really well, and by the time they finished recording together, Jimmie was dying basically.
Right.
They did last sessions. The thing with TB is he knew it was fatal. There was no way out, and it was very tragic. It wasn't that long before drugs that could prolong it. It's not really curable to this day. It's just fixable. They can make you healthier so you get through it.
Right.
There's people dying of tuberculosis around the world right now.
Yeah.
But it got much more treatable, and just a few years later, there wasn't a whole lot they could do for him but try to be healthy. The most they could do for him is the one thing he would never do, which was rest.
Right.
He just wouldn't. And right to the last minute, he was wanting more recording sessions so he'd have more money to leave to his family.
Right.
That's what it comes down to.
It did come down to that. Jimmie Rodgers recorded until 2 days before his death on May 26, 1933, leaving behind a legacy of music that impacted not only country music, but popular music as a whole. And that story, as René Rodgers will say, only gets richer and deeper as we include more people in the story. So let's wrap up this episode of Instrumental History with some thoughts from René about where country music might be headed in the future. Word inclusiveness is a big thing in country music right now. We see people like Amethyst Kia bubbling up under the surface, people like Willie Carlisle with LGBT leanings. Is there active conversation at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum about inclusiveness? Do you guys talk about that? Or?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, this is a conversation that the museum field as a whole has been having for years.
Right.
And from my standpoint as head curator of the museum here in Bristol, what I want our museum to be is a place that welcomes everybody and that everybody can find something in the story that they can connect to.
Right.
Obviously, we're telling a very specific part of a larger story. But we work really hard to be sure that those other histories and other traditions that have really influenced this early commercial country music are part of that story. Talk about how artists are carrying that legacy and that tradition further and innovating it today. But also just, we're very fortunate. We are a Smithsonian-affiliated museum. We have a wonderful 2,000 square foot special exhibits gallery. That gives us a lot of scope to widen our focus and be sure that all of our community sees part of their history and story told there.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the exhibit that you're putting together that sounds like part of this conversation about women and old-time music. So give me the background on that.
Yeah, so this is an exhibit that one of our former collections manager, Emily Robinson, had first mentioned as she thought we should do this one day, and we're finally doing it. And it was just talking about the story of women in old-time music and their sort of place in it, because as with so many histories, in general, it's told from the male perspective and the male achievement and the male challenge. And so we wanted to sort of go deeper and talk about some of the hidden heroines, some of the people in the past who've been really foundational to old time music, some of whom you know immediately, Maybelle Carter.
Right.
Some of whom you might not know at all. And talk about how they set the foundation, but then also talk about the challenges that women might have faced in creating a career in music, especially in those early days. The kind of stereotypical gender
can't travel without a man with you. Like that kind of stuff. Yeah.
You shouldn't be doing this because you should be home taking care of the children in the house.
Right.
And, obviously there was women who plowed right through those stereotypes. But there was also women who's once they had a baby, they quit performing.
Right.
And there's women like Hattie Stoneman, for instance, who did perform still, but who did it while giving birth to 23 children. She reminds me of that story of is it Ginger Rodgers and Fred Astaire, that Ginger Rodgers did everything that Fred Astaire did, but she did it backwards and in heels.
Right.
Exactly. I think about Hattie Stoneman, she was singing. Obviously she didn't record as much as her husband Ernest, but she did record. She was a very talented musician, but she was also giving birth to 23 children and raising them.
Wow. 23
and
kids.
dealing with the struggle of losing many of those children, because we're talking about the 1920s here. We're talking about the Great Depression. But I think the big other thing about this exhibit that I'm super excited about is that it's about the past and that foundation, and it's about those challenges, but it's also about what women are doing today. So women in contemporary old-time music and how they are innovating, how they are carrying on traditions, how they are trying to open it up to other groups that might not be immediately associated with old-time music, but who have a part in it.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so we're really excited about it. So this is an internal exhibit that we're working on, and it will be opening up early next year, hopefully.
That's awesome. And then I think I talked to Scotty about this. Is this then an exhibit that will travel to other places?
Yep, we're planning to make it a traveling exhibit, and we hope to travel it to several museums around the region.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. Is this the first one you guys have done?
So we have done other internal exhibits, but this will be the first one we'll have planned from the start to be a traveling exhibit.
Amazing.
Yeah. It's exciting. It's daunting. Every day I get a little bit stressed about it, but it will all be good in the end.
Awesome. Thanks for tuning in to episode 1 of Instrumental History. My name is Clint Holley, and I've been your host today. I would like to thank Radio Bristol, the Birthplace of Country Music Museum, René Rodgers, Scotty Almany, Barry Mazor, and Harrison Hunt and Dave Polster for technical and editing assistance. Join me in 2 weeks when I interview Jason Honor, Chief Archivist at Martin Guitars, and Wayne Henderson, world-famous guitar builder. Until next time, have a great day.